Hello, and welcome to Distillations. I'm Alexis Pedrick.
And I'm Lisa Berry Drago. Today we have the pleasure of talking to Anna Reser and Layla McNeil, authors of the new book, Forces of Nature, The Women Who Changed Science.
We talked to them about moving beyond biographies, how women who had knowledge about the natural world were suspect,
and reintegrating women's history into mainstream history, not just treating it like its own separate thing.
Hi, guys. Welcome. Thanks for coming on the podcast with us. Why don't we start? Can you guys introduce yourselves and tell our listeners a little bit about your backgrounds?
Thank you for having us. I'm Anna Reser. I'm a historian of technology and writer. I study the American Space Program and also women in science, and I am the co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of Lady Science magazine.
I'm Layla McNeil. I'm a historian of science, and I focus on women and gender in the history of science, particularly the 19th century. And I am also one of the other co-founder of Lady Science and co-editor-in-chief.
So what we're here to talk about today, I mean, aside from all the other work that you do, which is so exciting to us, we are obviously here to talk about your book. And you're publishing a book in a pandemic year, which we joke about that we were going to do this, but you actually did do it. So how did this work? What was this process like?
Well, we actually started the bulk of the research and writing. We did most of that in like 2019, 2020, and we actually submitted the manuscript in December 2020. No, what year is it? December 2019. Wow. Time is weird now. So most of the like editing and dealing with layout and images and things like that happened during the pandemic. The main thing was that the pandemic just kind of shut down our publisher and a lot of the staff was furloughed. So it was supposed to be in October 2020 and then got pushed back to spring and keeps getting pushed back because of the pandemic and the Suez Canal. Most of the bulk of the work was done right before pandemic times.
So just tell us more about the book. So what is the heart of this book and how did this idea even come to be back in 2017?
Yes, the halcyon days.
Yeah, well, we were actually approached by the publisher and asked to develop a proposal. And initially it was going to be a kind of like collection of biographies of individuals. From the start, Layla and I were not as enthused about that idea. And so we pitched what ended up becoming the book, which is much more sort of contextual, critical histories. Each chapter is kind of a self-contained little slice of history. There are biographical details of individual people in each of the chapters, but I think as historians, and particularly as historians of women and gender, it was important to us that we put these people into their historical context rather than just kind of excerpting out the highlights of their lives and slap a portrait on there and then call it good. And also because that's sort of the format for books about women in history, is just like a collection of biographies, and we really wanted to kind of move past that. And the publishers they're amenable to that, and so we kind of redid our proposal and came up with some ideas of like thematic things that we wanted to talk about. And then from there, it was kind of off to the races.
I'm struck by something that you say that I've also recognized, that's a lot of the work on women in science, or, you know, in my field, women in art history, and just sort of like that it always leans on that biographical thing, the exceptional woman, the woman who rises above her circumstances. And it's sort of like this one isolated, like, it's like a marble being thrown out into a field. Like, here's the woman. I felt really strongly that this book does not replicate that. So could you talk a little bit about, you know, why that is and how you manage this tightrope act of not falling into that trap or form or archetype?
Well, I think one of the things, because me and Anna went through the same history of science grad program together, and one of the things that we always kind of talked about when we started collaborating on women and gender and science projects and stuff like that was that women's history is always taught as like something separate from regular history, that you have the great stream of history moving forward, and then you have another stream of women kind of trickling out next to it, you know? that makes it look like women The marble is like some anomaly that inserts itself into the stream of history once in a while. And what we've really done in our work since we started collaborating together was we wanted to show that women aren't this like separate stream of history, that they have been working in science and shaping science and being shaped by science just as much as men have. And so it was really important for us to give that historical context of what's going on in science at the time to show how they're participating and shaping that culture of science rather than them being seen as this like thing that's separate from the great progress of history. So that's something that me and Anna we always saw eye to eye on how we wanted to approach the history that we do.
Yeah, and I'll just add that you said, the one woman who rises above her circumstances. I think the circumstances part of that equation just gets glossed over a lot. That's what history is the circumstances in which people live and do things. And so kind of shifting our focus to that, to a larger context, and instead of just saying, oh yeah, women had a hard time getting into science, they did in a lot of ways, but they still did it, and how they did it and how they navigated that is the interesting story there, not just she was born here and she did a lot of science and she scooped up some rocks and turned them into radium or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and also like they rose above their circumstances. I think we all have this understanding that the circumstances is patriarchy, and it always is. Like but like it doesn't work the same way for every woman in every time period in every field of science, that there are different types of barriers for different kinds of women. Black women experience different barriers that white women do. Poor working class women experienced barriers that wealthier white women did not experience. So, sure, there's patriarchy kind of, the umbrella over all of those circumstances that keep women out, but they are not the same, and they don't affect women's lives in the same way, and women don't navigate them in the same way. And so that was also something that we wanted to really start to nuance and get inside of, rather than just saying circumstances.
For sure. I mean, I feel like, one thing that struck me when I was reading, like as a woman of color, like in this field, that most of the times, as you said, save for sort of the like beating the odds narrative, maybe you get like one woman of color that's mentioned on a list somewhere. It's always the same one. Like that's pretty much it. That's the beginning and end. But I feel like you guys, you really took the time to dive into what those odds really were, to start to like pick apart those experiences, why they were different, why they came with additional challenges. There's this really incredible moment where like you have, I think it's the ruling from Brown versus Board of Education, right? And I was struck by that because in this, I just so rarely hear education discussed, and sort of how school segregation affected all of that. I mean, like my dad was done with school before Brown versus Board of Education was ever passed. He'd never gone to a non-segregated school in his life. So my mom either, actually. So like it was so like I feel like, we talk about like slavery, we talk about like, those other sorts of things, but like 1954 is not that long ago. And so I'm just like curious for you guys, kind of like why that was important to you, kind of like what made you choose to focus on like that aspect of it, as opposed to sort of, like I said, the same old like slavery in the 19th century was like X, which is true. We all know this, but like that, what made you choose that?
For that chapter in particular, I relied really heavily on a conference report the conference was convened by women of color in science to talk about their careers and the specific barriers that they faced trying to get into science. And in that report, that's a huge part of their experience, and something that they cite as being really kind of formative is going to segregated schools and then being kind of funneled into certain university contexts because of that, and that like their education was so much more difficult. So I think, when we talk about like, oh, how do we get women in STEM or women of color into STEM? It's just like a pipeline problem.
It's super not.
It's super not. there are very specific barriers for Black women in particular to get that kind of education. The other thing is if you want to talk about like, oh, well, there just like aren't a lot of role models for women in color in science. It's like, well, there are for one thing. We just don't talk about them. But like, if there are less, there are reasons for that. And it's because the people who came up through those educational systems in the 50s who would be our role models now, like the legends in the field or whatever, they went through all of this stuff and their careers were affected by this. And so basically I just took from that report what these women said themselves about what they experienced, and that's a huge part of it.
And I think that when you do focus on white women, especially in the U.S. during the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow civil rights, you would think in reading about their biography that there was no Civil War. There was no Reconstruction. There was no social problems in the US while they were doing their career because it didn't inflict their lives in the same way. And so, you know, when we're talking about women in science during this time period, you know, that it's almost removed from the culture and the politics of the time because it was for them because they're white, you know. And so when we were dealing with those time periods in the book, we didn't just focus on the white women living during that time. This was the varied experience of women in science during this time. And Black women experienced it in this way, and they had to navigate the profession, especially like in nursing, coming out of the Civil War in a way that, you know, white women did not. And so their careers are tied to these political tides in ways that white women weren't. And we also didn't want to, of course, separate those out into different chapters to make it look like here's the mainstream of history, here's white women's history, and then next to that we've got Black women's history. So so I know in Ghostbusters they say don't cross the streams, but we did that. We crossed the streams.
Yeah, and what you're about nursing in particular, I think I didn't go, you know, super into depth in the chapter itself, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting and something that I try to keep in mind is that like with nursing in particular and with other fields that are like care fields, the experience that Black women have with the kind of like culture and sort of mythology of like the history of those fields is very, very, very different than what it would be for white women, because like the figure of like a nurse or a Mamie in Black history is tied to slavery. It can be very traumatic. You know, Black women didn't get to choose to be nurses for their family. It wasn't like that at all. They're being nurses to the families that owned them. So, you know, that's just, you can't talk about like the professionalization of nursing in the United States without bringing that up, because they're very different experiences. And so when someone like Mary Mahoney goes to nursing school, like the context for her is going to be much different than it is for the white women who are training as nurses. And so just trying to keep all of these things kind of afloat. We have a lot of moist metaphors in this discussion.
So we've got a float, we've got streams, we've got little rivers, we've got the flow of history. Just try to keep track. Yeah, that's right.
It made reading the book feel like a more complete experience. That like I saw part of it. Felt like I was not reading a history where I had to sort of be like, okay, well, let me have the pre-talk with myself where I say like, I know what this is. I know what the limitations of it are. I felt like, oh, I am in this book. I'm part of this history. And I think like kudos to you guys. Like that was awesome. I don't often get to have that experience.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad that you didn't have to like set up your boundaries and limitations in the same way.
I'm struck by some of the sources that you have used, things like that, the conference that's called Together to talk about, you know, women's education in science, Black women's education in science. And I'm thinking about where the places were that you were looking for women in science. So you were looking outside of the list of Nobel Prize awardees and, list of patents awarded, looking outside of those places, I think opens your scope up so much. And one of our favorite women, Madame Lavoisier, that division between, looking into the laboratory and not looking at the quote unquote, principal investigator, not looking at the PI, but looking at the lab assistants is another place where you find many more women that you might expect. So could you talk a little bit about looking, shifting focus a little bit and looking in another space for the women that you were going to feature?
Yeah, I think one of the places that me and Anna always work from is understanding that science isn't men in a white coat in a university or a lab. And when we can assume that science happens in other ways and is done by different people, it naturally allows us to see more figures like that, like in the chapter about anthropologists and archaeologists, neither one of those women had a university degree. And so we understand that science doesn't have to be a certain way. It doesn't mean you have to be degreed. And so when we do that, we're able to just see a whole new culture and a whole new world of science and discovery and inquiry. And in the wives and assistants chapter, when speaking about Lavoisier, is that we also wanted to kind of nuance that as well, that, especially with Lavoisier, she wasn't just some put upon wife just following her husband around and that he just exploited her labor and stuff like that. And one thing I wanted to show with that was that, they were also bound by their time period as well. And that she didn't publish on her own because women didn't publish on their own. And she played a very significant part in that partnership. He played a very important part in that partnership. And they both worked together, that it wasn't some sort of exploitative relationship. And they both seemed actually very okay with that. She seemed very okay with the arrangement that they had and that she enjoyed it. And so that we also need to nuance those stories as well to understand that that was one way that women participated in science in the past, and it was sometimes one that they were comfortable with and found joy in. And then there's cases where, the labor of the wife was exploited, and those stories are worth telling too. But I think, there's a whole spectrum of ways that women worked with men in science, women worked on their own in science, and that those are all varied experiences. And we tried to cover as many of those in the book as we could. We don't have a specific chapter on this, but something that just kind of naturally happens throughout the book is the changing of the professionalization of science and how women fit into that. So the professionalization of science during, when the Lavoisiers were working and publishing was completely different than what was then happening in the 19th century with women who were able to publish science works, but still weren't able to go to university. So what's considered a professional scientist changes throughout the entire book, depending on the time period. And women in their careers and how they were able to get into science is very much bound to the changing professionalization of science. Going from being involved in science because you're married to a wealthy man who has the means to have a laboratory in his house to that turning into a university degree, and that happens over a period of time. And women's careers are constantly shaped by that changing culture of science.
I mean, speaking of which, your book covers a huge span of history. I mean, from, quote unquote prehistory to right up till post World War II. So A, how did you do it? And B, what were some of the kind of struggles and strategies in making that work?
Well, I think, first of all, we would have preferred that it not be that long of a span.
We did have to accommodate some of the publishers' wishes.
Right. We're both modernists. And so getting back to ancient Sumeria was just I was just this, oh no, I don't know how to do any of this. One of our friends is a historian of Egyptology. And I think I specifically was you need to check my dates and dynasties for any mention of Egypt. And she was like, oh, I think you did fine. I was like, oh God.
Listen, in general, historians, we all have one teeny tiny portion of history that we know a lot about. And the rest we're kind of vaguely Yeah, I know some stuff. Lisa and I run into this all the time. We're like, if once we start talking about the 19th century, like I am in my element. But when we're in like early modern Europe, I'm like, and then some, there were people there. So that was happening. And
As soon as we get to a date with a 19 in it, I'm like, I don't know. There was a computer. Goodbye.
that's to be expected.
Well, I think in order to make this as sort of like definitive and wide scope as the publishers wanted, we definitely relied on things like biographical dictionaries and for the ancient period, like a lot of older works that we used as sources. And it's difficult, like the further back you go in time, the fewer records there are of anybody, much less women. And so at some point you're dealing with things that are stray into the like apocryphal or mythological. And so we decided we would just kind of lean into that. So when we talk about medicine in ancient Egypt or something, we just don't know that much about it. I mean, we all collectively, I know nothing about it.
But the amassed knowledge in the world is also small.
Yeah. And we also rely on making certain kinds of, I think, educated guesses and inferences about the different roles that women can have in certain societies.
And we make it clear when we're making inferences and assumptions, like educated ones. We make that clear. We want people to understand that history is not always a process of absolute knowledge and knowing, and that we can make educated guesses. But I think we need to be upfront with readers about when we're making those guesses so that we don't create these mythologized figures that aren't real or something like that. That's something that me and Anna were very, very conscious of doing in those early chapters.
Yeah, we kept like texting each other back and forth like, I think this person isn't real. I think this person was made up by Wikipedia. Like I cannot find anything about, I don't think this was a real person. And they have a Wikipedia page that says they're a real person. So we encountered a lot of that where it's just like, oh, okay, we're wading into the past that we don't understand very well, but we're also wading into like these like centuries of like mythologization, kind of crystallizing one name into like a real person and just inventing a whole biography for them. And it's not clear that they existed at all. So the tension of trying to kind of wade through all of that was really difficult.
I study alchemy. You don't need to tell me. I mean, who is Hermes Trismegistus? Really? Really, though? The amount of like ancient figures, ancient sages, etc., who turn out to be medieval inventions that's a non-zero number.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think I will not ask too many questions about the early period, but I have to tell you that chapter title, The Supernatural and the Sanctified, is just, it is mwah, chef's kiss. It's perfect. I could conservatively discuss the Thessalian sorceresses for, I don't know, 1,000 years, but I do want to talk about like a main theme that I felt came out of that, which was about like how common and frankly how quickly it was for women practicing science to become witchcraft, which I feel like we just like is this legacy that's like carried over. You were talking about sort of the professionalization of science and like obstetrics. We know that like once, like when men were involved, then it was becoming professionalized. But before that, it was like, oh, I guess midwives and ladies do those things and, it's fine. And so I was just struck by sort of how often it became, oh, well, those are witches, but it's because they're ladies trying to do science or trying to do medicine. And like, that whole process is just, we still carry that.
We do see, that there always is, whether it's going to be, witchcraft or something else, that women who do have some sort of knowledge about the universe or the cosmos or nature or something like that, that is just automatically suspect in some way. One of the things that I write about in that chapter is like, we're not 100% sure who these so-called witches were, if they were real. The only one we have a name for specifically is Aglonice, and we're not 100% sure that she was real. She's just the one that has been named. But whether she was real or not, the myth of the Thessalian witches who could draw down the moon during a lunar eclipse was so pervasive for so long that what we can pull from that is that women's knowledge of the cosmos and the workings of it was suspect. So, it becomes less important whether witches are real or or what, because what we can see from that is like the culture of how women were seen as having some sort of natural knowledge. And I think that comes out to be, to me at least, the more fascinating part of that history.
To loop back to something we were talking about earlier with nursing, because that was something I hadn't thought about. In the book, you guys talk about how nursing sort of occupied this unique space because it was actually a field that, like, from the beginning was like, well, that's where ladies can be, right? It suited sort of the work we thought women were well suited to do fit with nursing. And I don't think that means there were no struggles or no challenges or no hierarchy or patriarchy or anything like that. Like, certainly all of that existed. I had never thought of nursing like that, really. And I thought that was one of my favorite chapters.
Yeah, the nursing thing is really fascinating. Just the way that nursing became a profession in the United States. I think it has a lot to do with the Civil War, just because there's like a huge shortage of people to care for wounded. And women were kind of like flocking to these field hospitals to try and help. There was definitely, like you say, there were struggles and there was patriarchy in the professionalization of nursing. I think at that point, physicians were almost exclusively men, and they did feel challenged by the idea of a professional nurse being kind of in their space and being somebody who in particular has like access to kind of like codified scientific knowledge about the body, as opposed to just, I know about bodies because I raised a bunch of kids or something. And that was really challenging to a lot of physicians. And one of the interesting things about medical education in general for women in the United States is that a lot of people who advocated for that were opposed to women's colleges, opposed to having women's medical colleges and women's nursing colleges, because it was seen as kind of like capitulating to patriarchy to have like a totally separate educational kind of track for women that could then very easily just be degraded by male medical colleges by saying, well, that's just a ladies' college. So whatever degree or certification that you get from there doesn't count. It's not real. So there were advocates who were strongly opposed to creating women's medical colleges because then they saw that as just kind of giving up the fight to get women into men's medical colleges. So there's a lot of really interesting kind of history there, and also that the advocates for women's medical education in this period and people who are opening colleges and people who are training nurses, they were very like politically savvy and very kind of plugged in to this fight. It wasn't just something that kind of like, I think often we think about these histories as just kind of evolving on their own somehow instead of being like very forcibly directed by women. We are going to figure out how to get women medical education. We're going to figure out the best way to do it, and we're going to use all of our kind of political savvy to figure out how this is going to happen. And there are like internal conflicts about this. So it wasn't just that like, oh, well, we just built some medical colleges somewhere and then the women showed up and then that's how that happened. Like, it was a very fraught kind of history. And I think that that's really interesting and worth remembering when we think about how institutions that cater to women or that are accepting of women come into being. And it's not, they don't come out of nowhere.
I've been working a little bit on Rachel Bodley, who was a dean of the Women's Medical College in PA, and reading some of her commencement addresses, where she's basically talking to this crew of people who are probably going to go, women who are going to go out and work as doctors, maybe work in hospitals, maybe work at rural postings, etc. And she's like, please do chemistry, do original research, like go do original research. It was interesting to hear her talk to a group of professionals, but also like even within that, there's this distinction between the women doctors who may provide care and the research chemist who is a totally different level of medical researcher. And she's encouraging them to pursue it and try to and like attain that level. And it was interesting, so you have all these different spheres and levels where it's the women's college, it's the women doctors, then it's the women medical researchers, the women chemists. And it's like this whole, it's like you can visualize the sort of interlocking Venn diagram of like authority and status and all this happening at the same time.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about the professionalization of women in medicine, like at the Women's Medical College, is that getting the college set up and getting women into medical school and conferring degrees upon them was one thing. What do you do afterwards? Where are they going to intern? Where are they going to find a job when there's white male physicians that are a dime a dozen and ready to serve? Even after the Women's College was set up, institutions like what the Blackwell set up in New York were very important to give women hands-on practical training in a hospital setting, kind of like an internship or residency, because they weren't going to get that somewhere else. So it was the building of an entire system that could somehow support women, not just we set up the college and hooray, we're done. Like there was a whole process and a whole system that needed to be built up to support this new generation of women professionals.
This has been really special for us. And we could probably talk about medical school and exclusion and problems and suffering and oppression and joy and science forever. Thank you. We're gonna leave it here.
Yeah, this was, I'm just going to say it, the best interview we've ever done. Yeah, it was super fun.
Okay, now this is an honor.
Yeah, now this is, well.
Thank you so much for having us. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Distillations.
Remember, Distillations is more than a podcast. It's also a multimedia magazine.
You can find our videos, stories, and every single podcast episode at distillations.org. And you'll also find podcast transcripts and show notes.
You can follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and updates about the podcast and everything else going on in our museum, library, and research center.
This episode was produced by Mariel Carr and Rico Hernandez.
And it was mixed by Jonathan Pfeffer.
The Science History Institute remains committed to revealing the role of science in our world. Please support our efforts at sciencehistory.org/give now.
For Distillations, I'm Alexis Pedrick.
And I'm Lisa Berry Drago.
Thanks for listening.